A city on edge. In the year 66 CE, Jerusalem was a city suspended between worlds. Perched on its limestone ridges, crowned with the glimmering white walls of the Second Temple, it was both a place of unshakable faith and a tinderbox of political unrest. The Roman Empire claimed dominion over Judea, yet within the sacred city, zeal for independence burned like oil on a hidden flame. Markets still bustled with spices, oil, and sacrificial animals, but in the shadows of narrow alleys whispers carried, rumours of rebellion, dreams of divine deliverance, and mutterings of vengeance against the empire. At the time, Judea was more than just a province. It was a contested frontier where religion, politics, and culture clashed. Rome, with its iron legions, demanded tribute and obedience. Yet the people of Jerusalem, with memories of David and Solomon, saw themselves as chosen, living under God's covenant, not Rome's. Taxes were heavy, tempers heavier still. A single spark, many feared, could set the whole city alight. That spark came when Jewish rebels seized the fortress of Antonia and overwhelmed the Roman garrison stationed there. The city erupted in joy at first. The flames of revolt caught quickly, fueled by the sense that prophecy might be fulfilling itself, that the God of Israel was ready to topple the world's greatest empire. But beneath the fervour was a chilling truth. Jerusalem was not united. Some citizens begged for caution, others sharpened blades. Merchants feared trade would vanish, priests worried the temple itself would become a target, and yet crowds still cheered in the streets. Mainstream historians tell us this was the start of what we call the First Jewish-Roman War, stretching from 66 to 73 CE. But less often recalled is a curious detail. Some accounts describe an eerie omen in the skies. Ancient chroniclers claimed that a brilliant light in the form of a sword hovered above Jerusalem, hanging over the holy city like an omen of war. Was it a comet, a trick of atmosphere, or a later embellishment meant to lend divine gravity to unfolding events? Scholars still debate whether such celestial signs were real phenomena or carefully crafted symbols of doom, remembered, or perhaps invented, by generations after. In the city itself, factionalism was already visible. Zealots, the fiery nationalists, stirred the people with cries of holy resistance. The Sadducees, guardians of the temple's traditions, urged restraint. Pharisees argued over purity and law, while Essenes, those strange ascetics of the desert, largely kept away. And yet, all were bound together within Jerusalem's thick walls, a city with no escape once the Romans returned in force. What makes this opening scene so compelling is not simply the inevitability of conflict, but the tension of choice. At this stage, nothing was fated. Rome was distracted, Judea fractured, and yet there was still a chance, fragile, fleeting, that peace might be negotiated. We can imagine the night air of Jerusalem, filled with prayers rising from the temple courts, while beyond the hills, Roman scouts observed in silence. The two powers, faith and empire, were drawing closer by the day, like storm fronts destined to collide. For those who lived within the walls, it must have felt like standing at the edge of a blade. One wrong move could plunge the entire city into catastrophe, and yet defiance seemed irresistible. History teaches us that revolutions rarely begin with clear plans. They begin with passion, pride, and the belief that justice is on one side. In that fateful summer, Jerusalem believed it was the very centre of God's justice. The city on edge was now tipping forward, step by step, into the abyss of siege. Rome strikes back. Rome was not an empire that tolerated defiance for long. News of the uprising in Judea travelled swiftly along the arteries of the Mediterranean, reaching the Palatine Hill where Emperor Nero reigned. To him, this was more than just a provincial revolt. It was an affront to Roman prestige, a dangerous spark that could inspire rebellion elsewhere. And so, in 67 CE, he he dispatched one of his most capable generals, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history simply as Vespasian. Vespasian was not a patrician aristocrat polished in the forums of Rome, but a seasoned commander hardened by campaigns in Britain and Germany. He was pragmatic, patient, and utterly relentless when it came to war. To crush the Judean revolt, Nero gave him command of some of Rome's most disciplined forces, the 5th, 10th, and 15th legions. With auxiliary cavalry, engineers, and siege specialists, this was no punitive raid, it was the full weight of imperial vengeance. The Roman advance through Galilee was swift and merciless. Cities such as Jotapata fell after brutal sieges, their defenders massacred or sold into slavery. It was here that the Jewish historian Josephus, later the chronicler of these events, was captured. According to his own dramatic account, he predicted that Vespasian would one day become emperor, a prophecy that saved his life. Scholars still debate whether Josephus truly uttered such words at the time, or whether this was a clever story invented later to justify his survival and collaboration with Rome. Whatever the case, his writings would become the most detailed record of the war and the tragic fate of Jerusalem. As Vespasian carved his way south, Jerusalem braced for the inevitable. Refugees flooded into the city, swelling its population and straining supplies. Stories of Roman cruelty arrived with them, of crucifixions that lined the roads, of entire towns burned to ash. Yet within the city walls, such stories had a dual effect. While they terrified many, they also stiffened the resolve of zealots who proclaimed that only divine intervention could stand against such power. There is a lesser-known but fascinating detail from this phase of the campaign. Roman engineers, so efficient in their craft, were said to mark the terrain with chalk lines before constructing their siege works, measuring with mathematical precision where each tower, ramp, and wall would rise. To the defenders, these markings must have seemed like the careful sketches of doom, as if the empire was literally drafting the city's destruction. By 68 CE, Vespasian had subdued most of Judea. But then, history took an unexpected twist. Far away in Rome, political chaos erupted. Nero was deposed, civil war followed, and 4 emperors rose and fell in quick succession. For a moment, Jerusalem's defenders believed the hand of God was at work, that Rome, distracted by its own turmoil, might never return in full force. Yet fate had other plans. When the dust settled, Vespasian himself ascended to the imperial throne in 69 CE. Now emperor, he entrusted the final conquest of Jerusalem to his son Titus. What had begun as Nero's command would now become a Flavian dynasty's defining triumph. From this point onward, the struggle was no longer just about subduing a province. It was about legitimacy, empire, and legacy. For Titus, success in Jerusalem would mark his rise as heir to the throne. For the people within the city, it would mark the beginning of the darkest chapter in their history. Rome had struck back, and it was only the beginning. A divided defence. Inside Jerusalem's walls, the real enemy was not always Rome. As the legions massed beyond the hills, the city itself fractured into bitter rivalries that would prove just as lethal as any Roman blade. What should have been a unified defence turned into a civil war within the walls. The Zealots, those fiery defenders of independence, insisted that God alone would deliver the city. They rejected compromise, executed moderates, and seized control of strategic quarters. Opposing them were groups of aristocrats and priests who argued for negotiation, fearing that outright war against Rome was suicide. In between stood factions like the Sicarii, daggermen who assassinated rivals in crowded streets, sowing terror among their own people. Josephus describes Jerusalem at this time as a cauldron boiling over. Families hid food from one another, fearful that armed gangs would seize their stores. In one episode, rival groups even burned each other's granaries to deny supplies. reducing the city's chances of survival before the Romans had even breached the first wall. Scholars still debate whether these accounts are exaggerated. Josephus, after all, had reason to paint his former enemies in the worst light. Yet, archaeological evidence of charred storage rooms and ruined granaries suggests that, indeed, the city's defenders sabotaged their own future. Mainstream history records that the temple itself became a stronghold in this chaos. Priestly guards tried to maintain ritual order, but even the sacred courts were not immune. Zealot leaders brought their fighters into the holy precincts, spilling blood where once only sacrifices had flowed. Ordinary citizens, caught in the middle, must have experienced a surreal nightmare, prayers rising to heaven while screams echoed from within the same walls. One of the quirks of this period is the story of John of Giscala, a rebel leader who fled Galilee and arrived in Jerusalem with his followers. He quickly set himself up as a power broker, battling rivals not just with swords but with cunning politics. Some sources suggest he pretended to negotiate peace while secretly plotting dominance. Others claim he even dressed his men in priestly robes to lend divine legitimacy to his faction. Whether true or not, the tale shows how desperation blurred the lines between the sacred and the profane. To imagine Jerusalem in these years is to picture a fortress under siege from both outside and within. Imagine walking through its crowded streets, refugees huddled against the walls, children crying for bread, zealots shouting scripture while clutching bloodied daggers. The sound of hammers echoed as defences were reinforced, yet beneath it all was the unmistakable hum of discord, of neighbours watching each other with suspicion, of rival warlords carving the holy city into fiefdoms. The Romans, watching from beyond, could afford patience. Each day that passed, Jerusalem weakened itself, divided by its own hand. Historians often note that Rome's greatest ally in this war was not its siege engines, but Jerusalem's own factionalism. A city united might have withstood longer, a city divided was already collapsing from within. And yet, there were still voices of hope. Priests begged for reconciliation, merchants prayed for peace. Some even believed that if the factions could put aside their hatred, Jerusalem might yet hold out until Rome's turmoil in the west forced a retreat. But those hopes were as fragile as clay jars, shattered by every dagger thrust in the night. Jerusalem was preparing to face Rome, but its walls were already crumbling, not from battering rams but from distrust and civil war. The iron grip tightens. By the spring of 70 CE, Jerusalem was ringed by the most disciplined army the ancient world had ever seen. Titus, now in command, moved with cold precision. His legions dug trenches, built ramparts, and methodically tightened the noose. The city, once alive with trade and festival, now stood like an island of stone surrounded by a sea of iron. The Romans began with psychological warfare. They paraded prisoners from surrounding towns in view of the city's defenders, crucifying hundreds within sight of the walls. According to Josephus, up to 500 people a day were executed in this way, their bodies left to rot in the sun. The message was clear. Resistance meant slow, excruciating death. Yet the zealots within the city took these horrors as proof of Rome's barbarity and redoubled their cries for holy war. Titus pressed further, ordering his men to construct a circumvallation, a massive wall of earth, stone, and timber encircling the entire city. 40 kilometers of barrier rose in just 3 days, a feat of engineering so swift it must have felt almost supernatural to those trapped inside. This wall ensured that no one could flee, no supplies could enter, and starvation would do Rome's work as surely as swords or fire. Here we find one of the more curious details preserved in the chronicles. Roman soldiers supposedly carved mocking messages into the stones they stacked, taunting the besieged with jeers in Latin and Greek. Scholars still debate whether this was literal graffiti or simply Josephus's rhetorical flourish, but either way, it speaks to the psychological theatre of siege warfare. Every stone was not just a barrier, but a declaration: you are prisoners in your own holy city. Inside Jerusalem, panic began to spread. Citizens who once dreamed of divine deliverance now wondered if God had abandoned them. Refugees scoured alleys for scraps. Why? The zealot leaders cracked down with brutal punishments against any who spoke of surrender. The temple courts, once a place of worship and sacrifice, echoed with arguments, executions, and desperate prayers. For the Romans, time was on their side. Their camps were orderly, supplied from the countryside, guarded by palisades and watchtowers. To the defenders, watching from the ramparts, the sight must have been unbearable. Disciplined ranks drilling in formation, fires burning steadily, and siege engines being assembled piece by piece. The contrast between the chaotic hunger within and the organised power without grew sharper by the day. Mainstream history tells us that by midsummer the city was completely sealed, but a fringe tradition preserves a stranger claim that some desperate residents tried to smuggle valuables out of the city by swallowing gold coins, only to be captured and cut open by Roman soldiers who had heard rumours of this practice. Whether apocryphal or true, the tale captures the grotesque extremes to which starvation and fear could drive both the besieged and their besiegers. The circumvallation was more than just a wall. It was a trap for the human spirit. Imagine standing atop Jerusalem's battlements, looking out not at fields or freedom, but at an unbroken line of Roman ramparts, torches burning through the night like a necklace of fire. Each passing day must have felt like sand slipping through an hourglass, each hour tightening the iron grip. By now the siege was not simply a military campaign. It was a test of endurance, a clash of wills, and a slow descent into despair. And within the walls, hunger had already begun its cruel whisper, famine within. As the weeks dragged on, the true weapon of Rome was not the sword, but hunger. Inside Jerusalem, famine became a silent conqueror, moving faster than Titus's engines of war. The once bustling markets were empty, their stalls stripped of figs, oil and bread. Families who had once celebrated Passover with lamb and wine now fought over scraps of dried leather, chewed herbs pulled from the cracks in walls or gnawed on belts and sandals, softened in boiling water. Josephus, our most detailed witness, describes the horror with almost unbearable clarity. Children with swollen bellies wandering the streets, the elderly collapsing in doorways, mothers unable to produce milk for their infants. The living grew too weak to bury the dead, and corpses piled in alleys and homes alike. He insists that tens of thousands perished before a single Roman had stepped inside the walls. Yet scholars still debate whether his numbers are exaggerated, whether the scale of suffering was as vast as he claimed, or whether rhetorical horror magnified truth for Roman audiences who would later read his words. Even if the numbers are uncertain, the suffering is undeniable. Archaeological digs in Jerusalem have uncovered charred remains of food stores and fragments of animal bones that suggest desperate consumption. There are also chilling references in rabbinic traditions to the taste of famine, memories preserved not just as history, but as wounds passed down through generations. One of the most infamous stories from this period tells of a woman named Mary of Bethesda. According to Josephus, in her desperation, she roasted her own infant son and ate part of the body, offering the rest to shocked zealots who stumbled upon her home. It is a tale so ghastly that many modern scholars wonder if it is more allegory than fact, echoing ancient prophecies of mothers devouring their children during times of siege. Yet, whether literal or symbolic, the story reveals how famine stripped away the boundaries of human endurance, leaving behind only horror and shame. Meanwhile, the zealot leaders did little to ease the suffering. They hoarded what little grain remained for their fighters, and executed those who attempted to sneak outside the walls in search of food. Some of these desperate foragers were captured by the Romans and crucified by the hundreds, their gaunt figures displayed before the city as a grim warning. From the ramparts, the people of Jerusalem could see their starving kin nailed to crosses, too weak to even cry out. There is a haunting irony here. The temple, meant to be a house of abundance, where pilgrims brought offerings of grain, oil, and animals, now stood in the heart of a starving city. Ritual sacrifices continued even as ordinary families wasted away. Imagine the smell of incense mingling with the stench of rotting flesh, prayers for deliverance echoing over the wails of hungry children. A quirky but often overlooked detail comes from Roman accounts that note soldiers joking about Jerusalem being its own executioner. The Romans, efficient as they were, realized that hunger was doing more damage than their rams or towers. In their eyes, the city was destroying itself from within, a grim efficiency no engineer could design. And yet, amid all this darkness, hope flickered. Some still believed that deliverance would come, perhaps in the form of a Messiah rising to defeat Rome. Whispers of prophecy stirred the weak, promising that the darkest hour was only a test of faith. But hunger has a way of drowning out faith with the groans of empty stomachs. The famine was not merely a symptom of siege, it was a turning point, a psychological breaking of Jerusalem's will. The people were starving, and with each day their vision of freedom grew dim, and yet the city still clung desperately to its dream of divine rescue. False hopes rise, even as hunger hollowed out Jerusalem's strength. Strange currents of hope coursed through its people. The city was suffocating under famine and fear, yet within its walls, messianic fervour grew like a fever. Prophecies whispered in Scripture of a saviour, of divine armies sweeping away oppressors, were seized upon as literal promises that deliverance was near. In the darkest nights, torches lit the temple courts as zealots proclaimed that God's hand was about to strike down Rome. We must remember, Jerusalem was not just any city, it was the spiritual heart of a people who believed themselves chosen, bound to a covenant as old as Abraham. For many, to even imagine surrender was to betray that covenant. And so, while bodies lay unburied in the streets, voices thundered in the synagogues that God had allowed hunger only as a test of faith. Hold fast, they said, endure. Salvation was coming. One particularly curious detail comes from Josephus, who records that a prophet named Jesus, son of Ananias, wandered the city for years before the war, crying out warnings of doom. "Woe to Jerusalem!" he is said to have shouted ceaselessly, beaten by authorities, ignored by priests, mocked by crowds. When the siege began, many recalled his words and wondered if he had been a messenger of divine judgment. Scholars still debate whether this figure was historical or whether Josephus, writing for a Roman audience, used him as a symbol of prophetic madness. Yet his story fits the atmosphere of a city where prophecy and desperation blended into one. The zealot leaders leaned heavily on such hopes. They told their followers that Rome was crumbling. After all, had not civil war in the empire recently toppled Nero? Some believed that Rome's empire would be handed over to a Jewish Messiah, an interpretation of ambiguous passages from the Book of Daniel. This belief was so wrong that even Roman writers like Tacitus later remarked upon it, noting that many in Judea thought world dominion was destined to begin in Jerusalem. But not all embraced these promises. Moderates and realists, seeing the starvation around them, warned that prophecy could not fill empty stomachs. They begged for negotiation, for surrender before it was too late. Yet such voices were silenced, sometimes literally. The zealots executed dissenters, branding them traitors. For them, doubt was more dangerous than hunger, for it threatened the fragile faith holding the defense together. One fringe tale tells of would-be messianic leaders claiming miraculous powers, visions in the sky, signs in the temple, omens of divine wrath. Some even claimed to hear voices from the Holy of Holies promising victory. Whether these were lies, delusions, or the desperate inventions of starving men, we cannot know. Scholars still debate whether such visions reflected genuine mystical experiences or propaganda wielded to maintain morale. To imagine the city at this stage is to picture a paradox: bodies piling up, food gone, children crying in hunger, and yet processions of zealots marching through the streets, chanting psalms, waving weapons, and proclaiming that victory was at hand. The temple glowed with firelight as sacrifices continued, not as acts of grief, but of triumph foretold. And outside the walls the Romans watched with patient calculation. They had seen this pattern before in other provinces, rebels clinging to prophecy until reality crushed their dreams. For Titus and his men, the zealots' hope was a dangerous gift. It meant the defenders would not surrender, no matter how desperate, forcing the siege toward a final, bloody climax. False hopes had taken root in the starving city, and soon those hopes would turn the temple itself into the stage of the final battle. The temple as fortress. As famine deepened and prophecies multiplied, Jerusalem's last true citadel became not its outer walls, but the temple itself. Rising like a gleaming crown from Mount Moriah, its courts and colonnades had long symbolized the covenant between God and his people. But in 70 CE, the sacred precinct was transformed into a fortress. Marble and gold became barricades, sanctity gave way to slaughter, and the very heart of Jewish worship turned into the battlefield upon which destiny would be decided. The zealot factions, though often at war with each other, poured their strength into occupying the temple complex. They fortified its gates, raised defences atop its porticos, and stored whatever grain remained in its chambers. Josephus describes warriors fighting beneath the giant gilded doors and archways, their blood mingling with the ashes of sacrifices. To the defenders, the temple was more than stone, it was God's dwelling, and as long as it stood, hope of divine rescue remained alive. But this transformation was not without scandal. Priests and common people alike recoiled at seeing blood spilled on the holy pavement where once choirs had sung psalms. Some accounts even claim zealot fighters mocked the sacred rituals, turning the sanctuary into a camp of soldiers and thieves. Scholars still debate whether Josephus exaggerated this sacrilege to appease Roman readers, or whether in truth the desperation of war erased the boundaries between sacred and profane. Either way, the temple was no longer simply a house of worship. It had become Jerusalem's final redoubt. One quirky but telling detail emerges from later tradition. Some defenders supposedly melted down ritual vessels to craft weapons. Golden trumpets and bowls, once used in festivals, were recast into spearheads and arrow tips. Whether literal or symbolic, this tale underscores how survival had overtaken sanctity. The instruments of prayer were now instruments of war. Outside the temple, the Romans drew closer. Siege towers advanced across the rocky ground. Ballista hurled stones that shook the city's foundations, and rams pounded the outer gates. Each impact echoed through the sacred courts, reminding defenders that their fortress was under constant assault. And yet, astonishingly, resistance held. Arrows rained down from the colonnades, flaming torches were hurled at siege towers, and defenders rolled boulders onto advancing soldiers. The temple, built as a sanctuary, became a killing ground. Imagine standing there, the blinding white stone reflecting sunlight by day, torches flickering against its walls by night, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and the chants of psalms recited as battle cries. Worship and warfare blended until they were indistinguishable. To the zealots, this was holy war made manifest, the very house of God shielding them from Rome. But the transformation carried a cruel irony. The temple, meant to unify, now deepened division. Moderate leaders pleaded that to fight within the sanctuary was blasphemy, yet zealots insisted it was the only place God would deliver victory. Every stone struck by Roman engines, every wall shaken by catapults, became both a wound to the city and to its faith. The temple's dual identity, as shrine and fortress, was unsustainable. For the Romans, it was simply the last obstacle to victory. For the defenders, it was all that remained of hope. And as both sides converged upon its courts, the battle for Jerusalem became inseparable from the fate of the holy sanctuary itself. Enter Titus. By the summer of 70 CE, the siege entered its final and most merciless stage. At its helm stood Titus, son of Vespasian, young, ambitious, and now charged with carrying his father's legacy to completion. For Titus, Jerusalem was not merely another campaign. It was the proving ground of his destiny, a theatre in which the Flavian dynasty's legitimacy would be carved into history. Titus was in his late 20s, handsome, educated, and unusually charismatic for a Roman commander. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's discipline, but cultivated a charm that won loyalty from his men. Ancient accounts say he moved easily among the ranks, sharing meals, speaking their language, earning affection as well as obedience. To his soldiers, this was no distant patrician, but a leader who fought alongside them. To the defenders within Jerusalem, however, his name would come to symbolize terror itself. Titus took command with precision. His first task was to maintain the encirclement wall, ensuring famine tightened its grip. His second was to coordinate a systematic assault, combining brute force with psychological pressure. He ordered siege towers to be wheeled closer, battering rams to strike at the city gates, and catapults to hurl stones the size of oxen through the air. The defenders must have watched in awe and horror as massive boulders, painted white for visibility, arced against the sky before crashing into walls and houses. Josephus claims that entire families were crushed in an instant, their homes reduced to rubble in showers of dust and screams. Yet Titus was not without restraint, at least at first. Josephus, who by now had become his interpreter and mediator, records that Titus attempted negotiations. He urged the defenders to surrender, promising mercy for those who laid down their arms. According to the account, Titus even wept at the sight of stay, grieving citizens, and pleaded for their leaders to spare the city from destruction. Scholars still debate whether this portrait of a compassionate general reflects reality, or whether Josephus, writing under Roman patronage, sought to soften the image of his conqueror. Some suggest Titus's tears were strategic theatre, meant to demoralize Jerusalem by presenting Rome as merciful and the Zealots as obstinate. A curious but often overlooked tidbit comes from Roman chroniclers who describe Titus carrying with him a collection of Greek plays and poetry, which he read between campaigns. The idea of the young general reciting verses of Homer or Euripides by torchlight, even as his legions prepared engines of death, highlights the contradictions of his character, cultured and ruthless, sensitive and yet relentless. Inside Jerusalem, Titus's presence was a source of both dread and defiance. Zealot leaders declared that his offers of mercy were lies, meant only to lure the city into surrender. They proclaimed him a new Nebuchadnezzar, destined to be destroyed by God's hand as the Babylonians once had been. For the starving populace, however, his promises must have sounded like the faint echo of salvation, a chance, however slim, to survive. But speaking such thoughts aloud was dangerous. To call for surrender was to court death at the hands of zealot enforcers. Thus, the siege pressed on. Titus, balancing patience with ferocity, tightened his strategy day by day. He was determined not merely to capture Jerusalem, but to break it so thoroughly that no revolt would ever rise again. To him, this was not just conquest, it was the stage on which empire, dynasty, and personal ambition would fuse. The sun had entered the stage, and with him came the promise of both triumph and annihilation. Engines of war. If famine was Rome's invisible weapon, its visible strength came thundering forward in the form of siege machines. Under Titus's command, the Roman legions unleashed the full arsenal of ancient warfare. To those trapped inside Jerusalem, the sight must have been like watching the gods themselves hammering at the gates. The Roman arsenal was terrifying in its variety. Siege towers, massive wooden structures taller than the city's walls, creaked forward on wheels reinforced with iron. From their upper levels, archers loosed volleys of arrows that rained down on defenders, while the lower decks housed battering rams tipped with iron heads shaped like wolves or bulls. Ballistae, giant torsion-powered engines, launched stones so large that entire rooftops collapsed upon impact. Catapults hurled clay pots filled with burning pitch, turning houses into infernos. Josephus describes defenders watching in horror as white-painted stones the size of oxen sailed through the air, gleaming like comets before smashing into the city. Alarm horns were blown to warn citizens of incoming projectiles, but the pace of attack was relentless. Walls shook, roofs splintered, and dust filled the sky until day and night blurred into one choking haze. And yet, Jerusalem did not collapse easily. The defenders responded with equal ingenuity. They hurled flaming torches onto siege towers, rolled boulders down steep slopes, and dug tunnels beneath Roman machines to destabilize them. One fringe but fascinating tale tells of defenders using captured Roman weapons against their makers, turning ballistae around to fire back into the enemy ranks. Scholars still debate whether this was literal truth or a dramatic flourish in Josephus's account, but it captures the desperate creativity of a city fighting with its last breath. There is also a quirky anecdote that Roman soldiers painted crud, caricatures of Jewish leaders on the sides of their siege engines, mocking their enemies as they advanced. Whether historical fact or legend, such graffiti reveals how psychological insult marched alongside physical assault in the theatre of war. For Titus, these engines were more than tools. They were symbols. Every tower wheeled forward, every ram crashing into gates, announced to the world that Rome's engineering genius was unstoppable. Siege warfare was as much a spectacle as it was a strategy. Soldiers worked in perfect unison, hammering, soaring, and chanting as they advanced, a living demonstration of empire's iron discipline. Inside Jerusalem, each strike must have sounded like the heartbeat of doom. Imagine trying to sleep in a starving city while, day and night, the deep reverberations of rams echoed through the streets like drumbeats of judgment. Every tremor carried the message, the walls will not hold forever. And yet, the walls did hold, for a time. Roman engines were burned, towers toppled, rams shattered by desperate sorties from the defenders. At one point, Titus himself narrowly escaped death when defenders broke out and set fire to siege works, forcing the legions into chaotic retreat. For a moment, the city believed God had turned the tide. But Rome did not falter long. Discipline, resources, and sheer persistence were on Titus's side. With every failure, the legions rebuilt, stronger and closer than before. The engines of war had begun their slow, methodical erosion, and soon the walls of Jerusalem would tremble under the weight of empire. Walls collapsing. The walls of Jerusalem, proud and ancient, had stood against invaders for centuries. But under the relentless pounding of Rome's engines, they began to yield. Day after day, battering rams struck the same stones until cracks spidered across the masonry. Siege towers loomed over the battlements, raining arrows down upon defenders who grew weaker with every passing hour. The sound of splintering rock echoed like thunder, and each collapse sent shockwaves through the city's already broken spirit. By late spring of 70 CE, the Romans breached the first of Jerusalem's three great defensive walls. Fighting spilled into the outer quarters, a brutal clash of sword against spear, fire against shield. Defenders hurled down stones and boiling oil, but the legions pressed forward with iron discipline. Josephus records that when the first wall fell, the Romans paused only briefly before turning their engines upon the second. The people of the city, already starving, now had to retreat closer and closer to the temple precincts, watching as their neighbourhoods were reduced to ash. Yet the collapse of each wall was not without cost to Rome. Defenders staged desperate sorties, charging through breaches with a ferocity born of despair. In one instance, a band of zealots drove the Romans back long enough to repair part of a shattered gate, singing psalms as they fought with fire-blackened blades. Stories like these, though often overshadowed by the city's ultimate destruction, reveal a haunting courage, men and women willing to hurl themselves into hopeless battles because surrender was unthinkable. Curiously, some accounts note that the Romans occasionally underestimated the defenders' tenacity. Titus himself is said to have been wounded in one skirmish, forcing his guards to rally around him. Whether exaggerated or true, this detail reminds us that the conquest of Jerusalem was not a smooth inevitability. The city's defenders, fractured as they were, managed to turn every breach into a bloody struggle. Scholars still debate whether these accounts of Roman setbacks reflect reality, or whether Josephus included them to dramatize the fall as a truly titanic contest, rather than a simple slaughter. Still, the outcome was never in doubt. Rome rebuilt every engine that was destroyed, replaced every soldier that was lost, and pressed inexorably forward. With each collapse, Jerusalem shrank. Streets once filled with market stalls turned into battle zones. Homes became barricades, and alleyways filled with corpses. For the ordinary citizen, survival meant retreating ever inward, until only the Temple Mount itself remained as sanctuary. There is an eerie image preserved in later traditions, that of Jerusalem's walls, echoing with the voices of defenders singing hymns, even as they crumbled under the force of Roman rams. Whether fact or myth, it captures the strange duality of the siege, faith clashing against stone, defiance ringing out against the grinding inevitability of empire. Imagine the scene from above, concentric rings of collapse, like a tightening spiral. First the outer wall, then the second, then the last. Each fall was not just physical, but psychological, crushing the defenders' morale, even as it narrowed their world. And still, within that shrinking space, the zealots shouted that God's deliverance was imminent. But as the second and third walls fell in succession, it became clear that deliverance was not coming. The walls of Jerusalem, once a source of pride and protection, were now rubble beneath Roman boots. And soon the final sanctuary, the temple itself, would stand alone against the empire. Fire consumes. The temple of Jerusalem, once radiant in marble and gold, now became the epicenter of the siege. Titus, according to Josephus, initially gave orders to preserve it. Rome admired grandeur, and the temple's brilliance rivaled even the great monuments of the empire. A sanctuary of such magnificence could be paraded as a prize, a symbol of Rome's mercy as well as its might. Yet amid chaos, command often slips from intention to catastrophe. As the Romans pushed through the final defences, the battle spilled into the courts of the temple. Zealots fought with a desperation that defied reason, hurling spears, torches, and curses from the colonnades. Roman soldiers, enraged by weeks of resistance, set fires to colonnades and outer chambers, whether by order or impulse remains uncertain. Soon flames licked at the temple's outer walls, the smoke rising like a black crown above the city. Josephus gives us the most vivid account. He claims that Titus, seeing the fire spread, rushed to order his men to extinguish it, but the frenzy of battle had overtaken discipline. Soldiers, driven by fury and greed for gold, hurled more torches into the sanctuary. One hurled brand found its mark in a window, and soon the inner chambers were ablaze. Scholars still debate whether Titus truly tried to save the temple, or whether Josephus, writing under his patronage, crafted this narrative to soften his image. Some suggest the destruction was inevitable, whether by accident, disobedience, or cold calculation. Inside, the devastation was absolute. The great veil of the sanctuary shriveled in fire. Golden lampstands melted, and carved cedar beams crashed in showers of sparks. Accounts claim that molten gold from the roof's gilding ran between the stones, later pried out by Roman soldiers when the fire cooled. A sacred treasury became plunder, its riches fueling the very empire that had brought ruin. There is a haunting legend that as the temple burned, strange voices were heard crying, "Let us depart from here." Some took it as angels abandoning the holy place, others as the presence of God itself withdrawing. Scholars still debate whether such traditions reflect eyewitness memory, prophetic imagination, or later theological reflection on a loss too great to comprehend. For the defenders, the sight was shattering. The temple had been their fortress and their faith, the axis around which the world turned. Now it was a furnace. Zealots continued to fight in the flames, some perishing willingly in its courts rather than surrender. The sacred ground, meant for sacrifice, had become a sacrifice itself, consumed not by ritual fire, but by the unrelenting blaze of war. Outside the walls, the Romans looked upon the inferno with awe. For them, this was triumph, proof that no god of Judea could stand against Jupiter and the empire. The glow of the burning temple lit the night sky for miles, visible even from distant camps. To Roman soldiers, it was a festival of victory. To the people of Jerusalem, it was the death of a covenant. Imagine the heat rolling through the city, the ash raining down, the once glorious sanctuary collapsing beam by beam. The fire consumed not only wood and stone, but memory, identity, and hope. From that night onward, Jerusalem would never be the same. The massacre. The fire was not the end. It was only the prelude to slaughter. When the temple collapsed into ash, Jerusalem itself dissolved into a theatre of death. Roman legions surged through the streets like a tide of steel, cutting down anyone in their path. Josephus writes of tens of thousands perishing, their bodies left unburied, choking the alleys with death. Even he, prone to embellishment, seems stunned by the sheer magnitude of the killing. By now, the city was a trap. No food, no escape, no walls left to shield them. Families huddled in ruined homes, clutching what little remained. Children, scraps of bread, relics of a faith that was burning away. The Romans showed no mercy. Old men were cut down, the sick trampled, the desperate dragged from hiding. Slaves too weak to fetch a price were slaughtered on the spot. Those fit for bondage were bound in chains, to be paraded later in Rome's triumph. One particularly gruesome detail comes from Josephus. The valley outside Jerusalem was so filled with corpses that the ground seemed to shift like a grotesque carpet of the dead. Birds of carrion circled overhead, and the stench of decay carried far beyond the city. Scholars still debate the accuracy of these numbers. Josephus claims over 1 million deaths, a figure most modern historians consider inflated. Yet, even halved or quartered, the massacre remains staggering, among the darkest chapters of antiquity. Amid this slaughter are tales both tragic and bizarre. Some fringe reports describe Romans finding hoards of swallowed coins inside corpses. Desperate citizens had gulped down gold in the hope of smuggling wealth past their conquerors. When word spread, soldiers began cutting open bodies in search of hidden treasure. The line between battlefield and butchery blurred completely. The zealots fought on, even when the cause was lost. Bands of defenders barricaded themselves in towers, choosing death over capture. Others fled into underground tunnels where they either starved or were smoked out by Roman torches. Still others threw themselves into the flames, preferring to perish in the temple's ruins rather than witness Rome's triumph. For Titus, this massacre was both victory and embarrassment. He had wished for a prize, a city tamed, a temple spared, yet what he received was an ash heap drenched in blood. Josephus insists Titus walked through the ruins, shaking his head at the waste, but others suggest he may have welcomed the destruction, for no symbol of Jewish defiance remained to inspire revolt again. Scholars still debate whether Titus was the reluctant destroyer or the cold strategist who allowed events to run their course. For the survivors, there was no debate, only grief. Mothers wailed over dead children, sons were marched away in chains, priests who once guarded the altar were dragged to the slave markets. The massacre of Jerusalem was not just physical extermination, but a tearing apart of identity, faith, and future. The city that had once claimed to be the centre of the world now lay silent. Streets, once alive with pilgrims and song, were filled with corpses and fire. The massacre was not only Rome's revenge, it was the end of a world, spoils of empire. When the killing finally subsided, what remained of Jerusalem was little more than ruin. Smoke rose from the Temple Mount, mingling with the cries of the chained survivors. For the Romans, this devastation was not just vengeance, it was profit. Soldiers scoured the city for treasure, plundering anything of value. Gold and silver were stripped from sanctuaries, households, and even corpses. The sacred menorah, the golden table of the showbread, and the trumpets of the temple were seized, destined to become trophies of the empire. Josephus tells us that so much gold was looted that it flooded the markets of Syria, driving down prices across the region. A city once rich in devotion and pilgrimage now enriched its conquerors through the grim commerce of plunder. Among the spoils were not only objects but people. Tens of thousands of captives were marched away, some to the mines of Egypt, others to the arenas of Rome where they would die as entertainment. Children were sold as slaves. Families were broken apart forever. One of the strangest stories concerns the rumoured hidden treasures of the temple. Legends speak of priests who buried sacred vessels deep underground or spirited them away through tunnels before the Romans breached the walls. Some later traditions even claim the Ark of the Covenant was among these, though by the 1st century most scholars believe it had long vanished. Still, whispers of hidden relics fueled centuries of speculation, inspiring treasure hunters and apocalyptic dreams alike. Scholars still debate whether any such treasures truly escaped Rome's grasp, or whether the myth arose from longing for what had been irretrievably lost. Meanwhile, the Romans revelled in their triumph. Soldiers carried their spoils on shoulders, while generals counted the wealth in ledgers. For Titus, the spoils would fund public works in the empire, famously, the Colosseum in Rome. It is sobering to imagine that the very stones and gold of Jerusalem, wrested from the holy city, financed spectacles of blood where gladiators fought and beasts were slaughtered before roaring crowds. The fall of one city became the entertainment of another. Captives, too, became living spoils. Josephus records that Jewish prisoners were paraded in fetters, some displayed as curiosities in triumphal processions, others slaughtered in mock battles. Among them were artisans and scholars pressed into Roman service, their skills absorbed into the very culture that had crushed their homeland. The memory of their chains was etched not only in their bodies, but in the psyche of the survivors who scattered across the Mediterranean. And yet, among the Romans, there was also unease. They had taken wealth beyond measure, yes, but at a cost that horrified even seasoned legionaries. The stench of burning flesh and endless corpses haunted their memories. Plunder and profit could not erase the fact that the conquest had been a bloodbath. Rome had claimed victory, but in doing so, it had extinguished a jewel of civilization, leaving only spoils to testify to its former glory. Thus the wealth of Jerusalem, both real and imagined, became the empire's prize. But for those who had once worshipped in its courts, every piece of gold and silver carried not triumph, but the echo of loss. The Arch of Titus, Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, did not allow its victory to remain a fleeting memory. In 71 CE, Titus returned to the imperial capital, greeted not with quiet ceremony, but with one of the most magnificent triumphal processions ever staged. Survivors of Jerusalem's fall were marched in chains through the streets, displayed as proof of Rome's supremacy. Behind them came wagons laden with plunder, heaps of gold, silver, and sacred vessels once consecrated to the God of Israel. Among these, most striking were the temple's great menorah and trumpets, borne aloft for all to see. The climax of this pageantry was carved in stone a few years later. The Arch of Titus, erected on the Via Sacra, immortalized the spectacle in relief. Even today, the carvings show Roman soldiers carrying the seven-branched menorah, its form unmistakable. Crowds of onlookers can be seen in the background, their faces turned toward the trophies. The arch proclaimed not just the victory of a general, but the submission of a people, frozen forever in marble. But the arch is more than art. It is propaganda. It tells us what Rome wanted the world to remember: the glory of conquest, the humiliation of resistance. What it does not show are the massacres, the famine, the corpses piled in valleys. Memory was curated, as it so often is, to elevate empire and erase suffering. Scholars still debate how much of Josephus's own account was shaped by the same pressures, writing under the patronage of Titus and Vespasian, torn between loyalty to his people and survival under Rome. There is a peculiar irony in the Arch of Titus. For centuries, Jews walking beneath it in Rome would avert their gaze, refusing to pass under its shadow. Some traditions even claim Jews avoided the Via Sacra altogether, unwilling to look upon their ancestors' humiliation carved in stone. Yet the menorah depicted there, once paraded in chains, became a symbol reborn. In modern times, that same form has been adopted as the emblem of the State of Israel, an ancient trophy reclaimed as identity rather than defeat. The arch itself survived the rise and fall of empires, weathering the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the modern world. Today, tourists wander beneath it, perhaps snapping photos, perhaps unaware that the images above them are echoes of one of the most catastrophic defeats in Jewish history. The very stone carries within it both triumph and trauma, pride and pain. One fringe tale insists that the menorah never truly remained in Rome, that it was hidden away, spirited to Byzantium, or buried beneath the Tiber in secret. Treasure legends swirl around the arch's reliefs like ghosts, whispering of objects that may still rest in forgotten vaults. Scholars still debate whether these stories reflect any real possibility, or whether they are simply the product of longing for what was lost. The Arch of Titus was Rome's way of saying, "This happened, and it was ours." But history is never so one-sided. For those who look closely, the relief does not only boast of victory, it also testifies to the resilience of memory. Empires may carve triumphs into stone, but the meaning of those images can change with time, reshaped by the very people they sought to humiliate. Echoes through time. The smoke of Jerusalem's ruin eventually drifted away, but its echoes did not. The year 70 CE became a hinge in history, not only for Jews, but for the wider world. With the temple gone, the heart of Jewish worship was silenced. Sacrificial rites ceased, priests lost their sacred role, and the community scattered. In place of temple-centered religion arose the rabbinic tradition, portable, resilient, focused on scripture and law rather than sacrifice. What might have seemed like an ending became, paradoxically, a beginning. Rome, too, was transformed. The victory cemented the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian's reign, funded in part by Jerusalem's spoils, brought stability after Nero's chaos. Titus was celebrated as a conqueror, though his short reign ended with an early death. For Rome, the destruction of Jerusalem was proof that rebellion could never stand against the empire. Yet within a few centuries, the empire itself would crumble, leaving the memory of Jerusalem's fall preserved in texts, ruins and art long after Rome's legions vanished. For Christians, the siege took on theological meaning. The temple's destruction was interpreted by some as divine judgment, confirming the new covenant preached by early followers of Jesus. For Jews, however, it was catastrophe, Churban, the great destruction, an open wound that reshaped prayer, memory, and identity. The fast of Tisha B'Av, still observed today, mourns not only the first temple destroyed by Babylonians, but also this second temple consumed by Roman fire. Scholars still debate whether the theological interpretations came immediately or only crystallized in later centuries when memory hardened into ritual. Echoes spread further. The Jewish diaspora, already forming, now accelerated. Survivors fled to Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and beyond. Communities scattered, yet carried Jerusalem in their hearts, ensuring that the longing for return endured across millennia. In synagogues built thousands of miles away, prayers still ended with the words, "Next year in Jerusalem," a quiet defiance against the empire that thought it had erased a people. There are curious quirks in this long aftermath. Medieval legends claimed the stones of the temple were cursed, that anyone who touched them would suffer misfortune. Later explorers searched for secret tunnels beneath the mount, hoping to unearth treasures buried during the siege. Even in the modern age, archaeology struggles with the site's contested layers, every shard and wall fragment tied not only to history, but to identity, faith, and politics. Scholars still debate what precisely remains beneath the surface and whether excavation should even be attempted. And in our own time, the echoes remain uncannily alive. The Western Wall, once part of the temple complex, draws millions who come to touch its stones, press folded prayers into its cracks, and weep for what was lost. The Arch of Titus still stands in Rome, but now, as we saw, its images are reinterpreted. Symbols once carried in chains have become emblems of sovereignty. The siege of Jerusalem was more than a military event. It was the collision of empire and faith, brutality and endurance, memory and myth. Its shockwaves have reverberated for 2,000 years, shaping religions, cultures, and the very idea of exile and return. And perhaps that is the most haunting truth. Empires fall, cities burn, but stories endure. The stones may lie in ruin, yet the memory of Jerusalem's siege continues to whisper across time, reminding us of both humanity's capacity for destruction and for survival. Conclusion. The siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE was not merely an episode of war. It was a turning point that reshaped the spiritual and cultural landscape of the world. The city's destruction ended an ancient order, scattering a people while forcing the birth of new traditions. For Rome, it was a triumph, carved forever into stone. For the Jewish people, it was a tragedy remembered in tears, prayers, and longing. And yet, from that catastrophe emerged resilience. The diaspora carried memory across continents, and the ruins of the temple became symbols of endurance rather than defeat. Empires sought to define the meaning of Jerusalem's fall, but over centuries it became clear. The story belongs not to conquerors, but to those who remembered, mourned, and rebuilt. The siege remains both a warning and a testament that even in ruin, identity endures.